Good evening, I'm Hugh Downs.
And I'm Barbara Walters, and this is 2020.
On the ABC News Magazine, 2020, with Hugh Downs and Barbara Walters. Tonight, the shocking story of the Marcos family fortune.
Compared to Mrs. Marcos, Marie Antoinette was a bag lady.
The extravagant world Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos shared for 20 years is now exposed. ABC News' Jim Laurie joins 2020 from the Philippines to show us rack after rack of designer dresses, imported shoes, priceless art treasures, gems, and gold-plated bathrooms, all part of an unbelievable lifestyle.
And from all over the world, ABC News is gathering the evidence, bills, payoffs, mansions, and land deals.
A lot of this money, I believe, is U.S. money, is U.S. taxpayers' money that has come out of USA to the Philippines.
John Martin joins 2020 to report on how the fortune was accumulated and who covered up the Marcos millions. Money really was no object for the Marcos family during its years in power, as these bills from the Italian couturier Valentino suggest. Imelda Marcos thought nothing of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on her wardrobe. But it was in the Manila Palace, home of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, that literally no expense was spared. ABC's Jim Laurie is there.
That the Marcos family led a lavish lifestyle surprised just about no one here, but the real extent of their extravagance has surprised quite a few. The personal videotapes, more than 1,000, shot by the palace cameraman, tell part of the story of parties at the glittering custom-built disco at Malacañang, the presidential palace. Of the special friends Imelda Marcos had, pianist Van Cliburn, who came to play, actor George Hamilton, who came to sing, "Sun's gone, we'll have it on the bow." It was a family which partied often. New Year's, anniversaries, birthdays, all very important occasions. For Imelda's last birthday, last July, her husband composed a song. Imelda, my little sweetheart. And if she was a sweetheart, she was of the most expensive kind. To all who knew her, Imelda Marcos was the real spender in the family. Imelda Marcos, it seems, seldom distinguished between government property and that of her own. Despite increasing poverty here, a 10% contraction in the economy in the past few years, she pushed through dozens of lavish personal pet projects, some very much white elephants. There was the Coconut Palace, built to host Pope John Paul in his 1981 visit. The Vatican found the palace excessive and the Pope stayed elsewhere. Much of the time since, its 17 rooms have remained empty. Few guests to gaze at the portraits of the Marcoses made entirely from genuine pearls. Few guests to worship in the ornate chapel with its precious icons and crowns of jewels. The haste in which her buildings were built led to tragedy in 1981. The $9 million Manila Film Center collapsed during construction, killing 30 workmen. Imelda, saying there was no time to dig out the dead, ordered the work to continue. More cement poured over them. And the reason the building was rushed? So that it could house a Manila Film Festival. A festival closed down a year later for lack of money. Across the nation, there are several Marcos mansions and monuments. Ferdinand Marcos still gazes down on the Marcos Golf Course, the complex built by the Ministry of Tourism at a cost of $500,000 and the dislocation of 81 poor farm families.
This is my house before. I feel like crying.
The principal Marcos home for 20 years was Malacañang, at the turn of the century, home to the American Governor General here. The palace rests on the Pasig River, which was used to ferry out Marcos' wealth in the hours before they fled. Over the years, the river also a nuisance. flooding the palace at typhoon time, forcing Imelda Marcos literally to walk the plank to keep the hem of her evening gown dry. In 1979, the First Lady totally refurbished the palace. The expensive mahogany-like floors and paneling were valued at $100,000 per room. She added new artwork, including many portraits of herself.
She went on a crash course because her taste started improving, although it tended to be a little bit ostentatious. What we call in the Philippines, strambotico.
Artists who worked for her said her taste in art reflected the dreamlike world in which she lived.
She was very enthusiastic when it came to fantasy. The first portrait that I did for her, she never liked it because I tried to capture reality.
Much of Imelda's remodeling went into her bedroom, a dark and vast boudoir. Not far from the foot of her bed, a large walk-in vault, housing her collection of jewelry and icons worth millions of dollars. Much of it taken with her on the American helicopters, the remainder now at the Philippine Central Bank. Beneath the bedroom, her wardrobe, a veritable department store of shoes and clothing. Bought in bulk, 2,200 shoes, often several colors, same design. Friends say they were only spares.
Imelda Marcos was one who never threw anything away, including things she never wore. A Bill Blass suit from Bergdorf Goodman, New York, bought in 1983 for $238, and an assortment of other suits and blouses bought in Rome and Paris. The price tags still in place.
Those who knew her and examined the Marcos residence shortly after they left say Imelda's penchant for hoarding was rooted in her youth, in the superstitions of a young girl born into poverty in a remote rural village.
She never threw anything away because she believes that too, that if anybody gets her old stuff, you know, they'll do voodoo on her and she'll lose her powers.
The Imelda Marcos bathroom, too, is a study in abundance. Jacuzzi bath and shower fixtures, all gold-plated, and a dozen baskets of imported perfume soap and other finds, false eyelashes and fingernails and imported perfumes. Elsewhere, cartons containing more than 1,000 pairs of nylons. For the first family, living well was the best revenge, a habit passed on to the Marcos children, daughter Irene and Amy and son Bong Bong. When Irene was married in 1983, more than $200,000 were spent on clothing alone, purchased in Rome. And the presidential yacht, a commissioned ship in the Philippine Navy, became last year a party palace for the presidential children. The young man in the red bow tie, the presidential son. By contrast, the life of the father seems simple. Ferdinand Marcos preoccupied largely with his power and his health. His bedroom, large, stark, and bare. A hospital bed, oxygen tanks, and other medical equipment at the ready. A fully equipped basement clinic, too. Alongside the machines that monitored the president's health, the robust pictures of the man he was a few years ago and the man he wanted to be again. The personal videos also show another side of Marcos, his devotion to his grandchildren, a man who lavished time and money on his family. But time for Ferdinand Marcos was running out. In contrast to the elegance of the palace, on their final night, the Marcos family, apparently fearing attack, slept in a basement storeroom for the banquet crystal. On that final day, Marcos staged his last inaugural, a final speech to 2,000 invited supporters, and from Imelda, a final song. Dahil Sayo, because of you, there is a reason for living. On their last day in the Philippines, a sad ballad sung for the last crowd to cheer for Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. Malacañang Palace is now open to the general public. President Aquino wants especially the Philippine poor to see the extravagance of the last regime. But in all this, Filipinos are seeing only a fraction of the Marcos splendor, for most of their wealth is not here at all, but rather in foreign lands. You?
Jim Laurie in Manila, and thank you, Jim. In fact, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos also have access to and may have concealed ownership in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of real estate in the U.S. and Europe as well. In Manhattan alone, 5 properties worth an estimated $350 million, including a lavishly decorated townhouse on the fashionable and pricey East Side, an office building on Wall Street, a new $70 million shopping center across the street from Macy's, and a tower on Fifth Avenue.